Okay, now I'm going to talk about Chapter 7 of The Future of an Illusion. Chapter 7 is a very important chapter. In Chapter 6, we discussed Freud's distinction between illusion and error on the one hand, and also between illusion and delusion. And we saw that for Freud, religion is an illusion, and it's because it's based on wishful thinking. In chapter 7, okay, the book is called The Future of an Illusion. So chapter 6 basically tells you for the first time what Freud meant by that term. It's an illusion for Freud is anything based upon wishful thinking. In chapter 7, he begins chapter 7 is very interesting because he begins chapter 7 by discussing illusion and by noting that there are other illusions that he could be talking about. For example, he could be talking about political illusions. I mean, it might be that if we examined our political ideas, our ideas of democracy and freedom and stuff, we all say, we live in a democratic society and we have all these ideals, political ideals. Freud said, if we actually turn the gaze of scientific criticism on our political beliefs, we might discover, and he makes it very clear that it probably would be the case, that a lot of our ideals that we believe are solid, like democracy, for example, are really illusions. George Orwell would be a good person to read in that context. For Orwell, terms like democracy, socialism, these are meaningless terms, really, because they mean anything you want them to mean. As Orwell points out, every government calls itself democratic, no matter how totalitarian it is. So Freud is saying that if we examined political institutions, we'd probably find out that there are a lot of political illusions too. So he's not like saying, religion is the only illusion. In fact, Freud believes that probably many of our social, cultural beliefs are illusions. Religion just happens to be what he's talking about in this book. And many other people have come after Freud and have actually examined political beliefs and so on, and have pretty much have borne out what Freud said. I mean, if you think of in the last 50 years or so, with the critique of ideology that you've associated with people like Habermas, Michel Foucault, people like that, I mean, basically they're carrying out what Freud said. I mean, if you examine political institutions, you'll find out that most of them are illusions. And he also says the relationships between the sexes are probably illusory too. So there's illusions there. And finally, he says, which is very interesting because this basically calls into question his entire book. He says, since science is the kind of the standard, the criterion by which to judge other ideologies as illusions, Freud says science, if it was honest, would direct its analysis against itself. And so Freud says if science actually examined itself, it might find that science itself is an illusion. Now, well, if that's the case, then that pretty much destroys the entire edifice of Freud's thought, because the whole book is based upon the distinction between science on the one hand and religion on the other hand. And religion for Freud is illusion, based on wishful thinking. And Freud says if science actually directed its gaze upon itself, it might find that it too is an illusion. So in that case, science would be on the same side as religion. Ironically, I mean, I'll talk about this later, but I'll just kind of mention it now. Freud thought that psychoanalysis, he thought psychoanalysis was science. That was he died in 1939. So we're in the 2020 now. So, he's been dead for like 80 years. But pretty much the consensus of academic psychology is academic psychology does not look upon psychoanalysis as a science. The general consensus today is that psychoanalysis is a mythology. It's Freud's mythology based upon basically wishful thinking. So ironically, psychoanalysis has turned out to be itself on the side of religion from a Freudian standpoint. So if religion is an illusion because it's based upon wishful thinking, it turns out that psychoanalysis is itself an illusion based upon wishful thinking. Anyway, so I'll talk about that a little after I'm finished kind of describing Freud's system. But anyway, so that's how he begins chapter 7 by noting that science itself may be an illusion. But science is the criterion by which we judge other things to be illusions. I mean, science for Freud is based upon facts and not wishful thinking, but it might turn out that science itself is an illusion. The interesting thing is he mentions that at the beginning of chapter 7, but the rest of the book, he never mentions it again. I mean, so in the back of the until you read on around, you read chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, 10, and finally get to chapter 10, and he never mentions it again. So it's always kind of in the back of your mind. You're always kind of thinking, since he raised the issue himself about science possibly being an illusion, you're constantly thinking, well, what about that? I mean, come on, answer the question. And he never does, except when he gets to the very last page of the book. Very interestingly, he then brings the subject up again because he knows he has to. I mean, he himself is thinking about it, and I assume things that a perceptive reader, would be thinking about it too. And he knows it has to be answered, and so he's the last page and a half or so. He addresses a question, and basically basically his conclusion is that, and here he follows kind of the ideas of Immanuel Kant without mentioning his name. Basically, he comes to the conclusion, one of the criticisms of science might be that science doesn't tell us about the world as it is in itself. It tells us about the world as it appears to our sense perception. So basically, what science gives us is a good description of the appearances, of how the world appears to us, but it has nothing to say about the world as it is independently of our perception. And now, okay, so basically, it's not telling us about, it's not giving us facts about the world as it is in itself. And Freud's basically answer to that is, oh, okay, he doesn't really disagree with it. He says, well, if that's how it is, that's how it is. He says, well, we really don't care about anything else anyway. I mean, what we care about is how the world appears to us, the world that we live in. But he does admit that science may have absolutely nothing to tell us about the world independent of our sense perception. And then Freud concludes his book by saying, science, he says, no, science is no illusion. So the question that he raised at the beginning of chapter 7, finally he addresses at the very end of the book, and he concludes by saying, no, science is no illusion. Okay, but anyway, so that's kind of interesting how in chapter 7 he does extend his concept of illusion beyond simply religion. So we could apply it to any cultural development, any cultural manifestation. Religion just happens to be what he's talking about in this book. Also, after that discussion, then he gets into he introduces the opponent. As I mentioned, every few chapters, this character called the opponent enters into the book. And as I mentioned before, the opponent is basically a rhetorical device by which Freud is, and it gives up Freud the opportunity to raise certain questions and kind of slow the argument down, and address certain questions that the reader might have, and that Freud also might have. Because he says, he doesn't want his book to proceed as a monologue without letting the reader, addressing the reader's concerns. So the opponent is that allows him to do that. And in chapter 7, at the beginning of chapter 7, the opponent, introduces the opponent again, and the opponent says, is kind of warns Freud. He says, you better be very careful because because civilization is kind of like a house, and what you're doing by criticizing religion, which is the foundation, at least for about a couple thousand years. Religion is the foundation of society, going back to the four mental assets. Civilization made a deal with individuals, and it offered four mental assets for presence, the greatest of which is religion. Religion is the very foundation of cultural stability. And so the opponent says to Freud, he says, you really shouldn't be doing this, because you're trying to avert one danger by introducing, because you think science is destroying religion, and you're trying to solve one problem, but actually creating a greater problem. Because if you destroy religion, if your book is going to contribute to, it's just going to give more ammunition to those people who are anti-religion, and it's going to result in the collapse of civilization, and that's a danger. So basically, the argument from Freud's opponent is that Freud is his writing this book on future of illusion is a dangerous enterprise for civilization. Okay, what does Freud say to that? First of all, Freud says it's not a danger at all. And why is that the case? Well, the opponent said it's a danger because all these people are going to lose their religious faith because of this book, and since Freud admitted that religion is kind of the foundation, it's the foundation of morality and so on. He hasn't really talked about that yet, but he will later on talk about that. Religion is the greatest of all the mental assets. It's the very foundation of civilization, and our morality, at least in Western culture, is thou shalt not kill. Where does that come from? The Ten Commandments comes from God's command to Moses, thou shalt not kill. So basically, Freud is saying, the opponent is saying, our morality is based upon religion, and you're messing around with the foundations of civilization. And the problem is, archaeologists, they do mess around with foundations of buildings and so on, but they are messing around with foundations of buildings of ancient civilizations where no one is living there anymore. But Freud is messing around with the foundations of European civilization, which there are people living here. And so that's very dangerous, because when the civilization collapses, there's going to be a lot of chaos and a lot of people are going to die. So Freud's answer to that is basically this. He says, don't worry about it. There's no danger, because first of all, my book that I'm writing, and he says, I haven't said anything new. It's been said, 1,000 times before by people smarter than I am. He says, my book is not going to have any effect whatsoever on believers, on religious believers. It's not going to, and no one will lose their faith because of anything I write. And the reason is because they don't believe because of reason anyway. They believe because of faith. And he says, if you're a true believer, you're not going to read my book anyway. You're going to have no interest in what I say, and you're not going to even care about it. Freud says, so that there's no danger there. And he also says that if anybody could be in danger, could be harmed by my book, it would be psychoanalysis, because now people will say, oh, now we know the hidden agenda of psychoanalysis is really atheistic. And Freud says psychoanalysis is not atheistic at all. It's a neutral mechanism. It's a neutral instrument of knowledge. And another person that could be injured is Freud himself, because now people will attack Freud as being insensitive to religious ideals, and as being, just somebody who has no appreciation of higher values, and as being this, terrible, immoral atheist. So Freud says, in previous ages, people like me writing this type of book, we would be tortured or imprisoned. But today, at most, what's going to happen is that people will say bad things about us, write bad things about us. And Freud says, well, that doesn't bother me. I'm mature enough, to ignore attacks like that. So Freud says basically to the opponent, don't worry about it. My book and books like this that attack religion will have no effect whatsoever on believers, on true believers, because they don't care about it. They don't care about what I say anyway. and their faith is based upon, it's an illusion. It's simply based on wishful thinking. It's not based on argument. Okay, that's all for today then.